Again in studio, this time about ethics in UK, but also a little bit about some forums in London. To understand my book, it's not easy, but it's also not easy to understand Angels Never Love. It is very, very difficult psychological term in novel. All women in London and UK must follow the simple author. The cultural forums in UK are not easy, and the book also explains the crisis in economics and medicine. To understand that in 18th century life was sometimes even better than modern life, it is some sort of unlogical, almost fiction when it comes to political forums. To understand different forms of gravity in UK, it's also not easy, but also the UK laws of motions. The Newton was thinking about that a lot. To understand different forms of natural selection in UK, it's also not easy when it comes to different forms of development. There is a lot of crisis in modern biology, but also in technology. To understand different forms in life, it's not easy, but also to understand aerospace when in different forms of UK, it's not easy, especially not with ethics from Europe. To understand that 7% of science in UK is based on science fiction, it is also not easy form of term to think about. To understand different forms of office together with science with book, it's not easy, but also to understand how people look sometime, and the people should more than author. The book is the ultimate source of everything that exists in universe, in Europe, in United Kingdom, and in America. And when people look for more internet access, they might be directed in a wrong way, like in past and history, where there is a lot of crisis made by greedy leaders. To understand simple forms of UK, it's not easy in domain of simple functions, but also the work together with different forms of boards. Different forms of appearance appeared in 18th centuries on the streets, but also different forms of book, and the visual apartments. The visual do not mean anything, and to have access to more visual forms some change the way of communication or thinking, but also pricing together with simple forms and establishment of forms of rooms. The origins in London, of course, are authorship of me, but also to understand different forms of industry between London and entire UK. To understand the transfers of ethics from me to UK or London, it's also not easy, but also open for United States of America and Europe to see what me is going on in my book portfolios, to understand implementations in philosophy together with different forms of work in science or laboratory license work, it's not easy, especially if that involves different forms of book or networks or different forms of ethics from different leaders to understand the practice, but also different forms of early life in London. It's not easy, especially if you think about life in 16th century together with Taoism. To understand different forms of work, it's not easy, and people on the net work a lot in modern age. But in 18th century, there were only author. To understand different forms of Armani code, it's also not easy, especially if you think about different forms of ethics, especially in fashion industry. There are also different forms of protocols in life, but also to understand different forms of working groups in London related with different forms of agents. To understand science, it's not easy, but also the algorithms together with science and fashion, especially if you think about different forms of DAO clinics or what is possible to make. Not a lot of people understand alternative medicine, but it's also important to understand that my opinion is actually, but also there should be some sort of standard in UK that alternative medicine is appropriate for people 26 plus. Of course, that is mostly only my opinion, but under 21, no one should really look for alternative medicine because it's simply too dangerous. It too much the options. To understand different forms of letters and how difficult is to prohibit some topics for under 21, it's also very, very strange thematics. All under 21 might resist and they will look for prohibited books or even to enter different forms of prohibited topics in universities in UK. To understand different forms of life, it's not easy, especially to think about Ireland and how much homes were built there in 18th century. To understand those pricings related to UK, it's also not easy. And when you think about different forms of adults or diverse author of me described in book, you should also think about broadband ethics. That means that there is also fashion, but also the contract with Virgin Media. The DVD there are not simple, but also to understand the wholesale and productivity of some workers under 26. The entire UK, it's very, very difficult, but also based on some simple virgin standards. To understand that and to build 18th century also psychology and how people believed in that time, it's not easy. To understand millions of different studios, it's not easy, but also to understand UK tourism or clinics that could be made, especially those alternative, are very, very difficult related to theory of dark rooms. Those dark rooms do not mean any form of modern world. They means a lot of tea and a lot of detox. To understand life, of course, it's not easy, and there are diverse forms in life, especially in UK, related to London. You'll see that there is a lot of different old picture also me made. Some are in museum, and some are in very, very small museums, not bigger one. Also to understand the outdoor private rooms in London, it's not easy because those are actually not only related to UK but also to entire Europe or how distribution goes. To understand the 18th century, it's not easy in UK, but it's also not easy to understand the 16th century, which is extremely, extremely difficult. If there would be any bacteria, of course, humanity should build up more vaccinations or simply thousands of cure that can actually build more pure society. The social areas are extremely, extremely critical, but sometimes it's just better to think about simple forms of cure in life. The cure and the early history in 18th century are very, very difficult topics when it comes to law. To understand the law heavy forms or how heavy or loud those could be, you should actually understand how privileged some people are, some authors that understand silence, but also zero emissions and no gas or poisons in social life or atmosphere. To understand different forms of healthy index, it's not easy, but also to adopt some simple ethics in UK together with Tao or medicine. The council of books, it's not easy, but also to direct all people under 26 to follow authors. That should be a term of every author, but also to understand different forms of council elections where people under 26 look for better and better forums for themselves, to build a better system for themselves and better life with more benefits. To understand simple ethics in life, it's not easy, but also diverse language that human can use. With language you use, you'll also understand self and self ethics better. With ethics, we all become better humans. Do not be deadly serious in life, but think about simple life, simple books, together with fiction parliament, but also with different forms of fiction government in UK, also the fiction of art police and policy, and building simple forums of geography that is not loud but silent UK forums. To understand ethics and neutrality in UK it's not easy, but also to understand political forums, especially in art, are easy forms and terms. To understand different forms of economic functions together with military in UK or the Red Cross are very, very difficult movements. Ethics and safety, it is also very important forum in UK and sometimes also similar to those in Europe. In 16th century, the Europe, there were very, very diverse organizations that built some standards to understand 15 specialized agencies that can build outer the VIPA World Intellectual Property Organization in UK is also not simple, but also related to other non-governmental forums and organizations. To understand different forms of ethics together with UK property issue, it's not easy. But to understand coordination of agents, it's also not easy together with ethics. There is a lot of chaos in life, but sometimes from that chaos you find simple forms of chief or administrator that is going to support you with better life and better price, of course. To understand heavily involved people under 26 interested in different political forums, everything become extremely heavy and complex. Sometimes also the cure are very, very important in UK because from that better life, but also better theory for life for everyone can evolve.